Hello and welcome to the 3CL podcast, a place where experts, enthusiasts and stakeholders come together to discuss the ever-changing landscape of education and technology. In today's episode, we interview US-based crypto expert, theoretical anthropologist and social scientist Natalie Smolenski. We asked Natalie to share some of her personal reflections on her career, concerns and her country's future. If you're new to us, the 3CL is an arm's-length edtech foundation operating across the Commonwealth and OSCE region. We operate a multinational network of academics, technologists, and stakeholders for the purpose of keeping the torch of digital literacy alive.
Okay, Natalie. Hello.
Hey. Hi.
This is a 3CL podcast number 2, 3, 4. We're trying to get the sequence right. I was trying to remember when I first met you, and I think it was 2015.
That's right.
In Saas-Fee, the mountains.
Yes.
I first knew your partner, Dan, because Dan and I were trying our best to get the European Graduate School to somehow move to Malta or have a presence in Malta. That's how it started. And I met you on my first trip to the mountains of Saas-Fee. So we, in our typical tradition of how we deal with these kind of podcasts. So the first question is, Natalie Smolenski, who are you?
An existential question. Well, I'm an anthropologist and a social scientist by background. I've also spent over a decade in the software industry, working on distributed digital technologies, blockchain technologies, as an anchor for self-sovereign digital identity. Built a company, sold a company, still with the acquiring company. So the world of enterprise software has become familiar to me, but my passion, what I've been involved in for many years now, is political theory, political economy. So I run an organization called the Texas Bitcoin Foundation. We're a public charity that specializes in research and education on Bitcoin and political economy. We have our first book coming out called The Satoshi Papers, which is available now for pre-order. And it is an examination of the relationship between money and state by 10 different scholars from all over the world, and taking different perspectives. So we've got economists, philosophers, anthropologists, historians, and I think that kind of broad interdisciplinary perspective is necessary to understand some of the changes the world is going through right now.
So what drives that focus into self-sovereign identity and blockchain for you?
If you recall, the Bitcoin white paper was published in 2008, right as the great financial crisis was taking hold. And so one of the pieces of text encoded in the Genesis block of the Bitcoin blockchain was the headline from the UK newspaper, Chancellor on verge of second bailout for banks. A few years later, we saw the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States, which galvanized attention from a broad coalition of political interests, which kind of called themselves the 99%, but they never really got to their one demand. That was kind of the slogan of OWS. What is our one demand? And they couldn't agree on what that was. But what is extraordinary about the Bitcoin white paper is that it formulated that one demand in code. So it basically said, look, this is a protocol for peer-to-peer transfer of digital cash. That's all it does. It's not trying to be a, virtual global computer. It's not trying to solve world hunger. It's not trying to, create world peace. All it's doing is disintermediating financial transacting from the banks, which are in effect indistinguishable at this point from the state. So in the United States, there was a court case in the 1970s that established a principle known as third-party doctrine, which states that if you are transacting through an intermediary, like a bank or a credit card company or a telephone company, this was before internet service providers, but now including internet service providers, the Supreme Court ruled that you have no reasonable expectation of privacy, meaning your Fourth Amendment constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure of your papers and effects do not apply to you. Now, as we live in a completely digital world, it is impossible to transact meaningfully today without going through third parties. So your bank, your payment provider, your ISP, any kind of digital service provider, in effect, has full legal leeway to collect whatever information they want and, in effect, share it with whomever they want. There is, there is privacy legislation, including here in the EU and many other parts of the world, but none of that legislation applies to the state. So the state is always authorized, so to speak, to surveil and control. Now, what is the remedy for this? Is the remedy legislative? Is it political? I would suggest there have been legislative and political remedies, but they've failed. They are always trailing indicators. The law is a trailing indicator of society. And so where does that leave the ordinary person who actually, let's say the ordinary American who genuinely believes in the Constitution and that nobody has the right to rummage through my personal effects and papers without due process, without a warrant, a suspicion that a crime has been committed, and then there is a process of investigation that has to meet certain legal guidelines in order for that evidence to be admissible in a court of law. So if that's your genuine principled point of view, then you could argue that the entire system of financial surveillance, including in the United States, is unconstitutional. Now, are we going to get back to a constitutional, mediated, third-party financial system? Maybe, but that is a multi-generational project on a very long time horizon. And so what can we do in the meantime? Well, we can build peer-to-peer protocols that circumvent the state in the sense that the state is not involved. No third party is involved in transacting. And I would suggest that that is, in fact, a human right. And so what we're seeing now is a kind of standoff between governments around the world, including the US government, which has extraordinary ambitions for total information awareness, not just on American citizens, but on everyone in the world at all times. And the self-sovereign subject, political subject, who is drawing limits around what is visible. That's what's at stake.
But is it this adversarial moment? Is this what you're feeling at the moment? Because I certainly, and I think you certainly felt it when we were in Vienna last week. No?
Look, I think the first place we should start with is, because you said, like, which domain does this really fall into? And if we see that, technology is rationalizing beyond the reach of regulators who still don't understand it, it kind of leaves it up to us, right? Either to develop the hardware and software solutions to these problems, and also sometimes we end up discussing cultural solutions to these problems. Maybe is it a culture where we should also start on, because this is what I'm getting to, like in Europe here, and as opposed to you guys in the States, like we look at the state as someone we might not necessarily, or maybe overall, not necessarily mind as interfering in our information architecture the same way as you guys might, right? Mm-hmm. So there's also that kind of cultural precedent around it. I mean, I want to kind of quickly move on before we start unpacking all of these big subjects in how your work, because I think it's important that we kind of contextualize who you are as we open up this discussion, how you see your work contributing to reshaping these traditional power structures. Like, where do you guys start? Do you start with, for example, trying to educate people, like what we're focused on, like what we're doing now? Or is it more specifically focused on advice to policymakers and governance?
Yeah. So I've gone both routes. In 2020, I co-founded an organization called the Texas Blockchain Council, which was a professional trade association. So we actually had a legal mandate to lobby on behalf of the Bitcoin industry in Texas, and we did that. And I built relationships with legislators and policymakers, both in the state of Texas and in Washington D.C. You know, I've briefed Congress. I've testified for the Texas state legislature, and that's all fine. There is a place in a democratic society for that kind of direct advocacy. But one of the things that I noticed repeatedly was that political advocacy is extremely tactical. And it's extremely short term. So it's all about, the details of statute, quick wins, good optics, re-election. And what tends to get lost in that activism is the bigger picture of what is the political philosophy underpinning our republic? What are our values as a people? How are they maybe different from the values of some of our neighbors, allies, or even our political enemies? What is it that, in the context of America, sets the American project apart? And this was what I kind of seized on, because in the United States, there actually are a lot of very statist political actors who, in effect, want the United States to be like Europe or even like China. They have this mantle of we have to compete with China, but it's like we have to compete with China by being a better China. And I kept trying to remind people that there is a theory, a political theory that you could call uniquely American historically, that traces back to the Revolutionary era, the era of the Enlightenment, where certain political principles got enshrined in a constitution that ostensibly still underpins our entire system of government, but is increasingly neglected, overlooked. Nobody cares about it. And so I kind of started seeing my role as like a prophet, like reminding people of what they claim to believe and actually seeing from their reactions, do they still believe this? Have they ever believed it at all? Or is the American project dead? And I'm optimistic enough to believe it's not.
I want to kind of angle this a bit closer to what we've been doing, and even how I first got to know Natalie, which is back to the concept of self-sovereignty.
Yeah.
Back to the notion of, because I mean, I've written a bit about blockchain, but I wrote about blockchain in education. And for me, my interest then was, is, and remains. I've never really believed in one-size-fits-all hegemonic education institutions anywhere. Yeah. And I've always been looking for something which is much more individualized, I guess. And also looking at the kind of projects we're still involved in. The whole notion of credential being almost like your social capital or cultural capital, economic capital, all rolled into one, okay? It's why people starve themselves to go to university, or they starve to send their kids to university. Yeah. Even what we had kind of agreed on years ago, which was that credential belongs to the recipient, now, to me, seems to be almost like fobbed off, even laughed at. And it's being fobbed off and laughed at on two bases. One is blockchain was deemed not to be sexy anymore. Guess what? Suddenly it may be, again, maybe. because of what's happened. And it's something I mentioned last week, I think. But also the idea of like, which centralized governments, institutions, whatever it is, will ever support decentralization when the whole principle about government is central power. And it seems to be that nothing much has changed. Yeah. So I don't know what you think about that, because I'm getting increasingly, I wouldn't even say desperate, like confused by the stance some people are taking now. In going back to even saying like, of course the credential, even in education, if Alex is going to go and slave away to university again and get his certificate, it doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the University of Malta because it needs to be validated and rest. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, very few people believe in or support self-sovereignty in any capacity. It's not a popular position. It never has been, and I doubt it ever will be. What self-sovereignty does, though, is architects the world in such a way that whether or not you believe in it or support it, you're forced to reckon with it as a material fact. So the ownership of a self-sovereign digital asset like Bitcoin, for example, is cryptographically secured. I mean, you as the individual, if you're self-custodying, not on an exchange, but if you actually own the asset, I mean, that is your digital property, but it's also, a bearer asset. So insofar as you can defend it, right? Both cryptographically and perhaps physically. And so that's what, when we talk about self-sovereignty, we're getting down to that level of what is the individual capable of protecting and defending. And in a world of total digitization and total information awareness by, the Five Eyes and governments around the world, that space for self-sovereignty is shrinking. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so it's up to civil society, rogue individuals, to literally build infrastructures that the state has to contend with. You can't break encryption.
But that's adversarial again, right?
Of course it is. Yeah.
And yet constitutionally enshrined in the United States, this idea of rogue individualism, this frontier kind of the unknown and going into it is just a very American idea, like a frontier conquered by these rogue individuals. I think we're coming full circle, which is good, and kind of wrapping up the entire American context in this equation. We'll get to them because the next subject is elites and power dynamics. But in fact, I think we might as well just jump in. You've written about the role of elites in shaping social structures. How do decentralized systems challenge traditional elite power structures? Well,
starting with the root of individual self-sovereignty. The sovereign individual does what he can with what he has and builds adjacencies from there. And so, jurisdiction is important. Law is important. The action of the state is important. Elites are important. But at the end of the day, we all have agency, and we all have a degree of self-sovereignty, and to the degree that we can protect it. And so, I mean, paradigmatic elite, someone like Elon Musk, I mean, he's come out and said point blank that the reason he has taken such an interest in American politics is because, from his point of view, America is the vanguard of self-sovereignty. And if America falls, there's really nowhere else for someone like him to go. That doesn't mean there aren't markets, but, him as an entrepreneur, he's staked his entire career on the viability of a project of individual liberty that is, at least in spirit, enshrined still in the American tradition. And so, he's an elite, obviously. He's using his power as an elite, but someone like him would not have the kind of cultural cachet that he has if it weren't for hundreds of thousands of people that you and I have never heard of, who are not elites, but who are willing to get their guns and protect what's theirs when they need to.
I like that. That's, again, very, very, very American way of looking at power structures and what's.
So what are we doing? Promoting guns now? I'm more interested in elites and your deconstruction of the word elites, because fine, you can say the tech bros are the elites, right? But I was also interested in what you wrote about elites being the middle class who educate their children or starve themselves for their kids to be educated, and they send these elites out into the world, and the elites end up working in extremely badly paid or non-paid internships. I mean, you guys know that many of these important institutions, the UNs of this world, you're expected to work for free as an intern. And what happens then? Okay, and I think that for me struck a chord at the time that you wrote it. So I wonder if you can deconstruct that a bit within this other side of the elites. So, because again, going back to last week, we had, I can never pronounce his surname, Caroline Cadwallader, I think, okay, who works for The Guardian, who said that I think she's been sued about 3 times by Elon Musk.
For context, she's the journalist that opened up the whole Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah, she's So and her view is just like, it's the end. She says it's going to be the end of The Guardian because the Observer has just been sold to an NGO or whatever it is, and they don't have enough money. So the concept of the elite is something which I think interests us as well, because I mean the 3CL has been trying ever since we set it up. You know, we're small. It's tech, learn tech. I keep on saying it's a learn tech foundation, but ultimately we're on the side of people who are addicted to learning and who don't look at technology as necessarily adversarial, but something which is empowering.
Yeah, well, but power comes in part from your capacity to defend what is yours through violence if necessary. And so there is a rooting of power in the capacity for violence, which, most of the time goes unexpressed, unrealized, but is understood and implicit in social relations. So, shifting back to the question of elites, the elites are, an elite in a society is not one thing. There are many different types of elites, and they compete with each other for power and influence, and they use different types of social violence. Some of it, very explicit, other types more covert, to secure and perpetuate their influence. And so there's a category of elites, which I called precarious elites, because they're sort of on the lower rung of the elite status. They don't have wealth. They don't maybe have as much positional power, but what they're striving for is employment in and a career in an elite profession. And elite professions, in our age include things like politics, being staffers, political advisors, even potentially politicians, education. Many education jobs are extremely poorly paid, even at, the university level and even at some very prestigious universities. Anything having to do with entertainment, acting, performing, the arts, that there's a reason that these jobs tend to attract the children of wealthy people, because there's a certain amount of capital that's needed to get started, and often there's very little prospect for new wealth generation in these roles. But the paradox is, because these roles are higher status socially, that is part of the compensation. Yeah. And so you could make 3 times as much money being a truck driver, like a long haul truck driver, than you could, adjunct professoring at a university, actually maybe 10 times more. But if you're a precarious elite, you often won't even consider that as a possibility because it is so low status. Even though your quality of life is better, your financial situation is better, your prospects of raising a family are all better. And so this gives precarious elite jobs a kind of musical chairs quality, which facilitates or creates an environment that facilitates abuse often. Many of these workers are treated worse than, like, factory workers in like pre-unionization, like pre-socialism era factories. And they have no hope of unionizing because there's so much demand for these jobs that they can immediately be let go and replaced with literally any one of hundreds of other precarious elites. And so there's no solidarity. There's a cutthroat environment. People feel ashamed and embarrassed that they're being mistreated, and they don't want to appear that way to other elites. So they may not talk about it or know what to do about it, even if they do. And so this is what I use to explain the appeal of socialism for a lot of young people today, particularly highly educated young people. They're going into these precarious elite jobs where they're truly being treated like shit. I mean, they truly hate their job, and they're not paid anything, and they're looking around and they're just like, this must be capitalism. And I would suggest it's not capitalism. Capitalism is neither here nor there, actually. What it is an oversupply of labor for very, very few positions.
Again, if you had to look at education as some sort of political system, that's meant to represent us. I'm finding, again, the old Victorian model refuses to be fissured, even like pre-COVID, and I thought things were going to change because of COVID, that there would be a much more personalized approach to education. I haven't seen much of that happening. And I still blame it on the power system, and I still blame it on the credential, and I still blame it on, you want this piece of paper, you want to wear the funny hat.
Right.
We give it to you when you've got to, tick all of these boxes. Whether people are really empowered at the end of it, I really don't know now. And I think that's what increasingly I'm trying to research now. Then the other thing is, and I don't know whether it's too early to jump or not jump into what I'm really feeling, which are these. I mean, I'm 63 years old and I'm teaching sometimes 19-year-olds.
Yeah.
And every year it's becoming more difficult for me to even get across to people, even have a conversation. Because it seems to be like they and I have already decided that we're in totally different spaces.
Yeah.
And that what binds us together is the performance culture of education. That you come in, you're meant to sit down, then what you're meant to do is hide behind the shield, right? I'm there doing my performing.
We pretend to learn, you pretend to teach.
And we pretend to learn, we pretend to teach, and I was even going to say cheat.
Yeah.
And off they go. And now with Gen AI, it's even more complicated. So I think these are the things which are interesting me and troubling me at the same time. And also because of the amount of time we all have collectively spent on trying to understand truths, whatever those might be, or trust in what. And I see all of these things as being interconnected, like mistrust in gatekeepers.
Mm-hmm.
Who is gatekeeping who? Where is the truth? Was there ever such a thing as a truth? How do we validate truth? And what do we do with the little time that we have to have impact, I think, which is the other thing. So what we're kind of convening around at the moment in terms of my travels around Europe and other places is I'm looking at the workplace now almost because of the Gen Zs. You said you're a millennial. These guys are Gen Zs, and the Gen Zs have entered the workplace with their smartphones though. Mm-hmm. And it's the smartphones which are being stuck in front of their face, but now they're also using the camera of the smartphone to document, to in a way, it's also another part of surveillance or even a part of personal empowerment for all I know. Yeah, right. I mean, he can have his camera in front of his head. Yeah, these cyborgs is I don't know how we used to say. So I don't know. I'm starting to think that with the time I've still got left, I really want to understand why there are so many either misunderstandings, but also how these people can work together. When we were in Sweden, one of the things I thought was really interesting was Alex and I and Chris, we were taken first to one of these online games company.
Yeah.
And it's where ethics came into. It's really interesting, so that you can create your own character. So Alex was there taking the piss out of me, just drawing me, for instance. Was this girl was saying that you could draw yourself, and here's my sister, and here's a frying pan. Can you put your sister in the frying pan? And should that be allowed or not? When you're 6 or 7, I remember. And then literally like an hour later, we went to an IT company, and somebody said, generations means nothing when you have a screen, because if you're playing a game, right, you can't tell people's age. Yeah. So I'm just wondering whether this kind of, some people think it's very dystopian, and the Swedes are seeing it as like almost like their liberation, knowing full well that behind them they have increasingly right-wing governments, and it's increasingly all around. I don't know how this fits into where you're going. I think certainly where we're going, we're trying. I think we hit a chord last week when we told people we want to do this kind of research, because I've been getting people connecting with us. But I don't know, what do you think, whether we're looking at things the wrong way? Because I still think we're still in the process of understanding what's going on. So when Alex told you or asked you, where do you think the US is going? Probably, I have no idea, because anything, there are so many different variables. So I don't know if you think we're looking at this the wrong way by looking at the workplace, different generations, the skills that you need, the digital literacies, or what it means to be a citizen.
Right. Well, I'd like to focus in on what you said about the intergenerational divide in the context of education. This is something I have some experience with, because I did teach at university for a time. And, I think one of the things that as a teacher, you always want to begin with is assessing the capacities of the students that are coming to you. So we've had an enormous transformation in social norms and behaviors and language as a result of always-on digital technologies. And so there's a huge gap in terms of norms between generations, and even from year to year. These generational distinctions in some ways are getting smaller and smaller. So as an educator, what I would ask is like, okay, what are the capacities of the students coming into my class? And then what are my goals for my time together with them? So I was teaching university in the era, like early rise of social media, but what many of my students had grown up on most recently was a cable television diet of, fair and balanced reporting. So kind of the whole Fox News revolution. This was, just after the war in Iraq era. And so the limitations that I saw in my students were they had this ironclad belief, an American democratic belief, that everyone was entitled to an opinion about everything. And that's true, of course, in a prosaic sense. I mean, you are free. You can have an opinion about anything. But they had not yet come to respect the process by which knowledge is arrived at and truth is arrived at. So they had on the one hand this point of view that, there are two opinions on everything. So I hear both, fair and balanced, and then I make up my mind which one I believe in. And of course, that's not that's not a model for anything, for any kind of real knowledge building. And so my goal with them, I was teaching history at the time, was just to get them to make an argument, to distinguish between an opinion and an argument. That's it. I was like, if you graduate from my class understanding the difference between an opinion and an argument, and that an argument is derived from evidence, and you have some basic sense for how to assess that evidence, I've been successful as a teacher. Now, that wouldn't be my goal in, say, a graduate seminar at the European Graduate School, or it might be, but in that era, my goals as a teacher likely would have been different. And so this goes back to what you were saying about individualized education or tailored education. Before we even get to the content of what is being taught, like, what are the basic cognitive distinctions that we need to help the student make before they can learn?
But I think going back to this education and technology lark we're in, it's increasingly complicated. And yet I feel we do have the tools. We're starting to get the tools to really personalize the learning experience for people. If some people say, I don't want to go and get stuck in a class for 2 hours.
Yeah.
I think there's institutional debates that are held about this. I mean, I'm studying communications right now, and the thing that they all seem to be telling us is that it actually doesn't cost that much to shoot high budget productions. And then someone puts up their hand and goes, well, why does it still cost millions and millions and millions? And they go, because there's intermediaries, there's middlemen, and no one wants to lose their jobs. Mm-hmm. And as soon as they start implementing technology that way, a lot of people are going to get axed. So there is this fear, this kind of technology allows us to rationalize the economy, but humans are what stands in the way. And then that comes into this whole debate about, like, are you some kind of transhumanist? Is this like, what is the nature, what's going to be the future nature of productivity? To take us quickly back onto that really nice little parable from when you was teaching history, what you brought up about being able to distinguish between what's an argument and what's an opinion is actually one of the main tenets of any debate about what's called digital literacy, right? So existing programs will grab, let's say, children under the age of 6 who just entered the education system, and they'll show them stuff like really basic formats of, this is a paid article, it's been sponsored, right? This is a Wikipedia page, okay? So this is actually very important to frame any conversations around this, is we always come back to these identifications of what is an opinion and what is an argument. I think globally, like, again, because of what we're saying, like, it's a very unique period that we live in, we can't turn to the past and relate. Even the recent past, like the 70s and the 80s, right? That doesn't seem very relatable. You talk about this divide more than anyone, right? So I think we should, just to take us all the way back.
Unless you get nuked.
Unless you get nuked, conflict does that. Conflict rallies everyone around the flag. I mean, don't touch America's boats, right? So I think we should probably loop all the way back to the beginning of the conversation, because we go all the way back to the American Constitution now. You know, this kind of it's let's just, for argument's sake, call it this, you know, irrelevant to today's time. It's not, but like irrelevant to today's time, kind of archaic piece of information that somehow does not accurately describe the world we live in today. How do you think that we can actually convince people of that opinion? You know, to recontextualize the debate back in this, what do you think we should turn to? Like, even like the wider kind of Whig history story of liberal democracy, it's being seen right now as incompatible with the means of information dissemination that we live in, or at least you know, young people are increasingly divided on this opinion. We're either going to the extreme left, extreme right, as you're saying, right? So where do we begin to remedy the old and the new, the young and the old, right? In terms of ideas, people, right? How do we use technology to interconnect us again? And also, I think it's a long question. I think, like, how can we use technology to connect us again? And, like, you know, from sides of the political spectrum, generations, right? What's the best way of going about it? And I think also to ask, how would you explain blockchain technology to someone who doesn't understand anything about it? What is probably the best analogy? Because again, this is something that you probably run into quite a lot, is people who have no idea, like legislators. Like, how do you explain it to them? How do you bridge that divide?
Well, so to the question of where we begin from an information technology standpoint, I think the first place we begin is recognizing that we don't get to control speech. Information wants to be free. there are now protocols for peer-to-peer communication that are fully baked into the fabric of the world. And so I think what that enables us to do, particularly young people to do, is to have conversations about topics that, may have seemed to be settled from the point of view of previous cultural orthodoxies, but aren't so settled in actual fact, need to be discussed and renegotiated. So this isn't a marketplace of ideas in the sense that ideas have some kind of a price function, but rather it's calling all of us to get better at how we think and argue in public. So I would suggest that, that younger generations are functioning from new types of literacy that older generations didn't. And that has certain pitfalls, but it also just has certain advantages. The public sphere is now global. Anyone can amplify themselves globally at an instant. People feel like they're always on screen, online, on camera. They're self-conscious of performing in different ways, and that poses new challenges, but also new opportunities for our civilization. And so I'm of the point of view that the remedy is getting good at freedom, getting good at being free, as opposed to trying to clamp down speech in various ways. So that's kind of the first part of your question. As to blockchain technology, I find it counterproductive to actually get into technological explanations without talking about use cases, particularly with legislators. And so I would say to them, like, forget blockchain, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is money. It is digital cash. You can also think of it as digital gold. And it functions atop a distributed peer-to-peer ledger, an accounting ledger. It's literally, the most boring thing in the world. Transaction, A sent X to B. That gets added to the chain. Okay, B sent Y to C. That gets added to the chain. And so it's this record of transactions without a bank. And this is out in the world now. You can't kill it. You can't stop it. So the only question is, what are you going to do as a government now that this exists?
Good follow-up question, unless you want to interject immediately, is what can they do? I mean, like you were on about recently how the United States wants to create a reserve, right? Mm-hmm. What kind of effect would that have on the market, and what are the limits to what big entities can do to the?
Well, there are a number of possible repercussions for the United States putting Bitcoin on its balance sheet. One is that every sovereign entity issues debt to finance the operation of the state. The United States issues more debt than any other sovereign in the world. In fact, our debt is the world's reserve asset. However, the rate at which other countries have been acquiring U.S. debt has been shrinking. So, China, Russia, the BRICS plus economies, they're investing less and less in U.S. debt. What does that mean? It means that a source of demand for dollars is drying up. And that is also constraining the budgets of the U.S. government. So what that trajectory points to is a potential sovereign default crisis at some point in the future. So we're not there yet, but there may come a time when nobody wants U.S. debt because they have no confidence that the U.S. government can repay any of that debt in the future. And so that creates a sovereign default. What Bitcoin does is it collateralizes a part of that debt with a hard asset, with, in effect, digital gold. So much like actual gold, which the US government also has quite a bit of, that functions as collateral that can be used for future sovereign lending. It also perhaps constrains, this is a lot more speculative, but it could constrain the rate of expansion of US debt because it is a reminder that fiat currency only has value to the extent that it can be collateralized. So it's kind of like saying like, okay, here's the real stuff over here, gold, Bitcoin, blah, blah, blah. Here's the debt. Let's make sure that they are somewhat in parity so that we don't have just like runaway inflation, runaway spending on warfare or whatever domestic entitlement programs. So that's kind of the hope, and we will see if that comes to pass.
Do you think it will make the market less volatile if major stakeholders start accumulating that much, or no?
Do you, by the market, do you mean the price of
the
Bitcoin?
Price? Yes.
Yeah. So we've basically been in the very early stages of monetization of Bitcoin, and so it's been very volatile, and I think that is to be expected. I mean, you've gone from introducing the asset in 2009 when the first transactions began happening to 2024. That's a very short period of time, and it is the fastest appreciating asset in human history. So like we've never actually introduced anything, any commodity, any asset that has appreciated in value so quickly. That said, there's a lot of uncertainty around it. There's a lot of learning happening in real time. And so, of course, it's been a volatile process. But there are 8 billion people on Earth. And as we move toward what some have called hyper-Bitcoinization, which is where Bitcoin becomes, is held by the majority of people, is transacted with, is used as a unit of account, is used as collateral. Like that volatility should even out. Yeah.
But right now, it ain't like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's still likely going to be pretty volatile.
Well, my bank prevents me from buying Bitcoin.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's as simple as that.
I mean, I don't see any better way to wrap this up with Alex's final personal and philosophical reflections, right? So,
which are which?
I think the last one is the best one, and I think we should start with it, which is, should we keep talking about women in tech, or is this discourse redundant? It would be cool to get your perspective on that.
Yeah. I actually wanted to write about this at some point because I've seen and heard a lot under the rubric of this topic, and I think there is a way in which technology, like many other domains of professional life, carries with it certain gendered expectations of like how one participates. And so the trends that I've seen around women in tech is that, men are kind of the crazy entrepreneurs who like take risks and like just build stuff and like move fast and break things. And then the role of women is to come in and be like the product mommy and the compliance expert and the governance person and the ethics person. And so there's this gendered division of labor that has grown up in technology where, women are expected to almost be like the conscience of technology. And men are supposed to actually be the ones who go out and build it. And so I think there is a need to just break that binary. I think girls should be raised to move fast and break things and make messes and take risks and fail. And boys, like whatever, raised with a sense for ethical responsibility, which I'm not sure that that's not happening either. And so I think both the kind of facile, let's say post-feminist, and then, kind of reaction against that is partaking in a gender binary that I don't think is helpful. I don't think it actually spurs innovation. I think it makes people defensive and fearful. And what we actually need is to have men and women working together on teams, on close teams, characterized by high trust, to deliver like extraordinary things into the world.
And it boils down to culture and meritocracy, I think, to some extent, because I mean, one of the hallmarks of the debates about keeping gender balance in organizations is the idea of gender quotas, right? Yeah. Which this incoming administration and this wave of populists is very anti. They're saying, let's get rid of that. Again, it's a middle ground. What you guys are talking about is kind of like culturally it has to change, but also we need to hire people for the right reasons. Right. So culturally, we need to encourage people to go into stuff that they're passionate about and they're good at doing. But at the same time, we shouldn't just be throwing people into places or just on the basis of what hangs between their legs, right? So I think that's pretty good. I think we can go to the first question that you wrote up, which is, what challenges have you faced in advocating for decentralized systems in a world dominated by centralized institutions?
Well, for the most part, I think people don't care. Like they're just like, okay, well, that's cool. Like, what is that? How does that impact me? So like with all technology adoption, adoption is bottom up, not top down. And mostly my interest has been ensuring that through public education, that people have the right mental models for what decentralized digital technologies are, so that they don't have instinctive hostile reactions. That said, they still will. And on a long enough time horizon, it doesn't matter, because they'll all be using Bitcoin.
Do you think that this comes from like us being very accustomed to ideas about positive liberty, and we don't think about negative liberty concepts anymore? Like the idea of we should be free from something, right? Yeah. It's something that's it's a debate only had in fringe political circles nowadays, like libertarians and communists, weirdly enough, right? They're the only ones who want to be free from right. Everyone else wants freedom of access too. Yeah. It's like, you're not giving these women these jobs, you're not giving them access to this, you're not giving so do you think that we've kind of just we've completely forgotten the negative liberty debate? Because I see you bringing it into frame. Like Alex and I aren't used to people bringing up negative liberties, right. But like every time we have someone from over the Atlantic come in, it's always the same, right? Yeah. It's always like you're grounding us back in, like, it's all a monopoly on violence, like so.
It's not actually. That's the wonderful thing.
Cool. It would be good. It would be good to get your perspective on it.
Yeah. No, the state claims a monopoly on violence, but that claim is never a fact. In fact, the state always fears the violence of the people, and every person is capable of rendering violence if and when needed. And so this is in fact how you preserve a corridor of liberty. Is the state literally fearing the violence of the people. Yeah. And the state will infringe because what is the logic of power? The power does what it can. It does what it's able to get away with. Power is opportunistic. Power is amoral. So it doesn't matter how great and awesome and good and ethical people you put in power are. Once they have that power, they will use it. And in ways that they can't even predict in advance. So you certainly can't predict it in advance. And so how do you check power? Well, with power. And the power of the people is a backstop. I mean, dictators fear it. Kim Jong-un fears the power of the North Korean people. Xi Jinping fears the power of the Chinese people.
Something that people often forget, right?
Yeah. So when we talk about negative liberty, in a way, what we're talking about is the limits of power. Where where do we keep those limits? And those limits are, to some extent, culturally negotiated.
Well, the next question is, how do you stay hopeful about the potential for technology to empower individuals rather than oppress them, which I think we've kind of inadvertently been answering the whole time. But it would be great to ask you about what you think, what you think the future of, the future of the technologies that you study is in, keeping us like in a positive situation rather than a negative. Like, where do you think the front line currently is for preserving free speech, for preserving individual privacy when it comes to financial transactions? What are like some cool case studies that if like a listener was listening, wanted to kind of like explore more on, like you could leave them with like stuff to follow?
Peer-to-peer. So at the end of the day, like all of our digital transacting needs to go peer-to-peer. And it's it's already possible. It just takes a little bit of technical skill and practice, habituation. You know, people are often afraid to do things peer-to-peer because they don't want to mess up or they don't fully understand the technology. But I would suggest for your listeners who are inclined to exercise their liberty, it's a really good exercise.
Sounds good. I think that pretty much wraps everything up for today. Intro and outro can be shot separately, so we don't need to keep anyone here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming on.
What a lovely conversation. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, of course.